calls.
Good morning, it's 10:04 on the 24th of October. This is Sadiq Khan, bringing you your latest edition of Speak to Sadiq on LBC. I'm here for the next 30 or so minutes taking your calls. This is your chance to put any questions you like to me, the Mayor of London, and I'll do my best to answer. So the numbers for you to get your questions in on air are 0345 6060973, or you can email sadiq@lbc.co.uk, or you can text on 84850. Don't forget, you can also watch Speak to Sadiq on the website lbc.co.uk or live on the LBC Facebook page. Mr. James O'Brien, how are you, sir?
Very well. Nice to see you.
You too, mate.
Should we crack on straight away with the calls this morning? And then, actually, before we do, were you on the march on Saturday? Were you marching?
I was indeed, yeah.
For the second referendum?
Yeah, I was. It was a wonderful, wonderful atmosphere. I mean, there were clearly lots of people marching for the first time in their lives, and that was lovely to see. Also, different generations, different ages, different backgrounds, people from all parts of the country. And you get a sense that people who were previously either, in the view that we should leave the European Union or weren't very political, are now realising the consequences of either a bad Brexit deal or a no deal. And I genuinely think the will of the people is changing.
Do you want to make a prediction about what you think is going to happen?
I think Theresa May will still be the Prime Minister over the course of the next few weeks and months. I think she will come back with a bad Brexit deal and portray it as better than the alternative no deal. I think some MPs will buy that spin. I'm hoping that Senate MPs look at the merits of the bad Brexit deal, reject that. In an ideal world, vote of no confidence with the general election. I think realistically that's not going to happen. And I'm hoping Parliament votes for the public to have a say on the deal the Prime Minister's done, with the option of staying in the EU. That will require an amendment to be put down from parliamentarians, which is why you can see.
Is this a hope or a prediction?
No. What this turns on is whether parliamentarians are successful in persuading the Speaker to allow an amendment to the inverted commas meaningful vote. You see the scam the government's trying to pull, which is not allow amendments on the vote that MPs will take, which means they've got a choice of accepting or rejecting the deal, and the fallback would be no deal. The key thing is for the Speaker to be brave and to allow parliamentarians to be able to move amendments.
Remind me what the Labour Party's official position is?
All options on the table.
Right.
All options on the table.
There isn't one.
Well, no. To be fair to the Labour Party nationally, in an ideal world, they want a general election. Why? Because they think this government is a shower, and they'd rather there be a Labour government than a Tory government. If they don't succeed in getting a new general election, all options are on the table, including a public vote.
Crack on with the calls.
Okay, the first caller is, I think, Jeremy. If I can read the screen right, there's a singing away.
Yes, it is. Sorry.
Jeremy, good morning. How are you, sir?
Morning, I'm very well, thank you. I got lots of good pictures on Saturday of people in T-shirts, plenty of banners and good dogs.
It was a great day.
That's not why I'm calling.
It was a great day, Jeremy. Jeremy, what's your question besides?
I just wanted to refer to your experience in Parliament vis-à-vis the topic of bullying.
Yeah.
I'm a business development consultant and author, and I've too often found myself dealing with the fallout of leaders whose management styles involve at least some bullying. Success in business is about performance. You can measure it in profitability or customer satisfaction and loyalty, both of which come out of motivation of the people working at the sharp end of the business. It reduces the motivation of bullying, reduces the motivation of people and damages the performance of their businesses to the extent I believe it costs our economy many millions of pounds in lost profits every year.
Yeah.
If that's the case, how would any bullying in Parliament be affecting the performance of our national economy?
Well, very good question. So just the importance of this issue is not simply the misery and hurt it causes the individual being bullied, but you're right to remind us it leads to a less productive workforce. One of the reasons why I'm working on a good work standard is to get more employers across London having good work standards. That includes, by the way, having a grievance procedure should somebody be the subject of bullying, but also training those in positions of power and influence not to bully. I'm afraid my experience, Jeremy, of Parliament is some MPs have never employed people before. A lot of MPs are working under huge pressure. I'm not excusing bullying, but it does take place in Parliament. How do I know this? Because some of the staff that I would recruit would share some of the stories they had in a previous job or experience other colleagues had of theirs working for other MPs. And my advice was always to make sure they join a trade union, make sure they take advantage of the grievance procedures. But a lot of MPs, a lot of employees haven't got proper procedures. I think the reality is we're seeing in the last few days and the last few weeks, and with the Cox report being published, evidence there is bullying in Parliament. The idea of this is the place that makes our legislations, including anti-bullying legislation, but has bullying taking place, should appall us. And that's why it's really important that Parliament accepts all the recommendations without change from Dame Laura Cox, and changes the culture of that place.
We're used to the kind of conflict nature between the different parties at different sides of the house, if you like. So there's an atmosphere of heightened aggravation, if you like. Does that bleed through to people just working back?
Well, Jeremy, you will know this. Look, a lot of places of work are stressful places, high-pressure places, and people in positions of power and influence in particular working at a huge strain. That does not excuse bullying. There is no excuse for bullying your staff. And by the way, it has an impact on recruitment, on retention, on progression. The longer your staff can stay in a place of work, the better they'll be, more productive they'll be. If they leave, it's bad. And what should worry us more is the bullying appears to be in particular against younger staff and women as well. But it's really important that Parliament gets on top of this and sends a message loud and clear. It's unacceptable.
What sort of things did you hear of? Because bullying is a very broad word.
So you'd hear stories of MPs shouting unreasonably at members of staff for doing something wrong or incorrect in their eyes, throwing things in an office, unreasonable expectations on members of staff, ringing them all hours of the day, and then being quite angry, unreasonably so.
But this was normal. I mean, you could be, I'm not being glib, you could be describing any newsroom in the country 10 years ago. So it's just a case of changing times, is it? Or is it?
Well, look, as Jeremy was alluding to, look, times have changed. We've got to make sure we realise those sorts of experiences and behaviours are not acceptable. The fact that we used to send children up chimneys 200 years ago doesn't mean it's acceptable now to do so. And similarly, we now know also, by the way, not simply for humane reasons and for moral reasons, but it affects productivity as well if you're having bullying in a workplace. And it's really important that we have places of work which are conducive to people performing to the best of their ability. That's not going to happen if they're being bullied.
There's an issue of self-preservation though with institutions, and this applies to everything, doesn't it? From allegations of child sexual abuse at schools and big organisations like that. My own school has essentially been accused of covering up all sorts of bad behaviour because, to use that dreadful word, brand. They have to protect the brand. So Parliament's in between a rock and a hard place, because the more bad news that emerges from Parliament, arguably the less faith we have in politicians, and that's bad for everybody.
Well, thankfully, the world we live in now, it's more difficult to cover up things. This sort of concern people have about reputational damage. We've got to realise that the reputational damage of things being covered up is worse in the long term than short-term cover-ups. And what's clear is actually, not just the Me Too experience recently, but also we've seen in the recent past more and more brave adults talking about stories what happened to them when they were children. But also, you've got to remember, if you're in politics and you've got the courage to report bullying, you've got to be really concerned about your future employment prospects. And that's why you can understand a culture where actually those who are victims of bullying may not want to report it.
We took a call yesterday from someone who wanted to report a full-on sexual assault at work and was asked first to contemplate the effect it might have on her own career. That's the sort of thing you're talking about. Anyway, sorry, carry on.
Jeremy, thanks for your call. The next caller is from Stevenage, and it's Laura. Good morning, Laura.
Good morning, Sadiq. How are you?
I'm good, actually. How are you doing?
Oh.
I'm fine, thank you. I spoke to you earlier this year about your takeaway policy around schools in your London plan.
Yeah.
And I said it wasn't going to work. And today or yesterday, there's been some figures released saying that there's been an increase in the number of takeaways across the country and in particular some areas of London. So my question really is, with the release of these figures, whether you're going to look at your intervention, maybe change something or make some additions, because I did mention to you some things that you could be doing more in schools in addition to what you're already doing.
Well, look, Laura, thank you for ringing in again. Let me give you some examples of how I've listened to some of the points you've made in relation to schools in particular. I was last week at a school in East London running the Daily Mile with a chap called Mo Farah. I beat him, by the way. But we were both beaten by 10-year-olds. And what we're encouraging all schools across London to do is to run the Daily Mile. It's basically 15 minutes during the course of a day where children will initially warm up and walk and then run for 15 minutes, and it's about a mile. And the evidence from Scotland, where this began, but also elsewhere where they do this, is this can lead to fewer children being obese or overweight. I was also last week in a nursery in Merton promoting my new Healthy Early Years London programme. And what this is about, Laura, is making sure those under fives have the right support in nurseries, with childminders, with early years centres, children's centres, to get a healthy beginning. That includes making sure they are drinking water rather than juices. That includes making sure they are walking, cycling, scootering to nursery. That includes getting mum, dad, carer in to make sure they work with the carers and parents to give them a good start in life. Simple things like making sure their children are taught how to brush their teeth properly to avoid tooth decay. We've also extended this, by the way, Laura, to schools. There is a healthy schools programme across all schools in London as well, to encourage schools to make sure they have decent nutrition. That includes, by the way, decent meals when it comes to school time. In addition to that, you're concerned by itself banning junk food on public transport network wouldn't be enough. I agree. The consultation's finished. We'll wait and see what the consultation said. And similarly, my new draft on the plan stops new fast food outlets opening within 400 metres of a school, and those new outlets that open longer than 400 metres away from school must commit to the healthy catering standards. We've got less frying, more baking or grilling. So it's a part of a package of measures we're doing, Laura, to address the real issue we have of obesity and overweight people in our city.
Laura, I'll leave you to question the Mayor about that response.
Thank you. Just in case you've forgotten, so I'm a social researcher at university. I'm just about to finish my PhD, which is about teenagers and food and eating and what influences this. I don't just look at nutrition and diet, I look at the different aspects around food as well, so looking at income and social factors.
Yep.
And I think my particular problem with this issue, and you're not the only politician that I've spoken to who does this, is that there's a real focus in on public health intervention as the answer, whilst ignoring the vast amount of social scientific evidence and expertise from people like myself, my colleagues and other people that I know in this field as part of the whole health promotion package. You know, food is not just about nutrition, it's not just about obesity, it's a social thing, it's about enjoyment and socialising. It also encompasses social class, social identities, culture, tradition, all those other social aspects, and it's also influenced by income and poverty. And I think those social aspects are missing from a lot of the health promotion. And what would I do? So I think from the young people I've spoken to in London over the last 3 years, that it's not just about the taste of food, it's the cost as well. So these takeaways that you're talking about, they can get more food for less of the cost than they get in school. So a lot of them will just wait until after school to eat, and they won't eat in the school.
Why Sadiq Khan did Brent Council? How can Brent Council actually ban, if I've understood it correctly, takeaway shops from opening near schools? How can they do that, and we can't do it more widely?
Because of the licences regime that Brent Council has, the local policies they've got. That's why
so you can't order councils to adopt the same policies?
The new London plan I'm going through now, the consultation phase, will do just that. So I'll give other councils the power to do so. But more importantly, if a council doesn't do so, we from City Hall can do so. But just to answer Laura's point, to be fair, Laura, I mean, as an academic, I thought you'd know this, but we've recently launched the Child Obesity Task Force, and we've got a world-leading academic professor, Karina Hawkes, as my vice chair, and Paul Linlay, the campaigner, as the chair. And they're looking at the whole issues you're talking about, the socioeconomic issues, the fact that bad food is cheaper, the fact that when you compare Barking and Dagenham, one of the most deprived wards in London, versus Richmond, one of the most affluent wards, you can see a big difference in obesity and overweightness. So we are doing that, Laura. I appreciate we're not going to do every single thing that your PhD thesis says we should do. But please get in touch with the Child Obesity Task Force we've launched at City Hall, London's first ever. And I'm sure you'd accept that Karina Hawkes and the others we've got on the task force know a bit about what they're talking about.
It's funny that advertising hasn't really been mentioned, because you one of the first things you did as mayor, of course, was to remove those body shaming adverts from Transport for London. a decision that many people still pretend not to understand. But clearly you have the powers to take down adverts that encourage unhealthy behaviours. So why, wherever I go, do I see fried chicken and fizzy pop and burgers smiling out at me from billboards and bus shelters?
And advertising does work. That's why,
they spend billions of pounds a year on it.
And so what we're doing is TfL is the world's biggest advertising space. The tubes, buses, bus stops, London Overground. So we've currently finished the consultation on banning adverts for junk food, and these are foods high in fats, sugar and salts. And we're reviewing the consultation. My understanding is, from preliminary questions asked, that it's broadly positive. So Londoners want us to be more responsible, and don't be surprised in the near future if I make an announcement saying that actually after consultations we now have a policy to ban foods high in fats, sugar and salts on the TfL network.
So watch this space.
Watch this space. Thank you for your call, Laura, and thanks for calling in again. I really do appreciate it. And please do get in touch with City Hall about the Child Obesity Task Force and the work we're doing. The next caller is from Bexley Heath, I think. It's Gavin. Good morning, Gavin.
Morning, Sadiq. How you doing?
Not bad, mate. How you doing?
Oh, can we stop with the how you doing?
On Saturday.
Gavin, listen, James is not used to his listeners being courteous to him, so
it's not a question of courtesy. It's a question of squeezing in as many substantive points as possible rather than mere polite exchanges.
Were you at the march on Saturday?
I was at the march on Saturday. It was good to see you there.
Great day, mate.
Nice turnout.
Great turnout.
What did you ring in for? Can you remember?
So, Mr. Mayor, I understand the Metropolitan Police has dropped or installed the campaign about the Brexit inquiry, so I think political sensitivities, in particular Russian interference. As the deputy head of the Met, what can you do to restart this campaign?
Well, Gavin, thanks.
Has Gavin got his facts right? This is certainly how it's been very underreported by most measures, that the Metropolitan Police have said they're not investigating alleged criminality within the Vote Leave campaign because of political sensitivities.
Yeah, Gavin, thanks for your question. Let me just tell you what my role is, because it's really important that I explain this. I am the Police and Crime Commissioner, in fact, so I've got I'm the person that holds the police to account and ultimately is accountable to you as a Londoner. The issues in relation to what matters the police investigate and how they do so are operational matters. And you'd appreciate we can't have politicians interfering with investigation matters that the police may do. But I've looked into the concerns raised about the, inverted commas, political insensitivity being used as an excuse, and I'm paraphrasing, for the police not investigating. And it's not true. What I understand is that in September last month, the police received the documentation from the Electoral Commission, who looked into the two campaigns we're talking about and found that they had breached the rules. As I understand it, there are thousands of pages of documents to be read. The police have a specialist prosecutor looking into these things. They'll be liaising with the CPS and will then make a decision in due course about whether the threshold has been reached to bring a criminal prosecution or not. And when that happens, they will make that public. And you'll appreciate, Gavin, because of my views on the referendum campaign, because of my prejudices, being frank, it would be wrong and improper for me as a politician to get involved in that process. But I've been told by the Met Police Service in no uncertain terms that political insensitivities are in no way to play for the apparent delay in this being made public.
Aren't you part of the problem then when you talk about your prejudices? Because you mean you're clearly in favour of staying in the European Union. You've changed your tune since 2016 when you described the referendum as sort of generational and final. Hang on, I haven't finished the question
You're
yet.
asking 4-1 though, to be fair.
No, I'll focus it down for you then. It's because when you say that you shouldn't get involved, that's sort of almost a skewed reality. If crimes have been committed, then your views on the referendum shouldn't be relevant to your enthusiasm for seeing an investigation.
Well, you can imagine if I was the advocate acting for
but that means you're letting the media write the rules. Go on.
Come on, James. Okay, at least answer one of your 4 questions.
Go on.
If I was the defendant's advocate acting for them in a criminal trial, I would make the point that this charge has been brought because of the prejudices of those bringing the charges rather than because the evidence reaching a threshold. And it's really important due process is allowed to take its course, even when we may not like the particular defendant in a particular case. In relation to my own personal views, it was here on LBC where I made the point after the referendum result, although I was devastated and heartbroken by the result, I accepted the verdict. 2 years ago, we couldn't have expected that 2 years on, the options on the table would be a bad Brexit deal or no deal whatsoever. That's a million miles away from what we were promised. In those circumstances, I think it's right and proper that the British public, for the first time, by the way, should have a say on the outcome of those negotiations with the option of staying in the EU. I'm not a best of 3, a best of 5, an referendum guy, but I am somebody who believes that when promises made 2 years ago are broken, the public are in a far better position to decide on that rather than politicians who fail to get a decent deal.
Speaking of your appearances on LBC, Steve's been in touch. Say every phone-in I listen to with Sadiq Khan, it's always in the pipeline, in the pipeline, in the pipeline. What would you point to, Steve, as something you have actually definitively delivered?
Well, let's give me some examples. I promised to freeze TfL fares after they've gone up by 42% in the previous 8 years. Promise made, promise kept. I promised to bring in the Hopper fare, unlimited bus travel within an hour. Boris Johnson said it couldn't be done. It was unfeasible. Promise made, promise delivered. I promised to bring in a night tube where 5 lines would run on all Friday night and all Saturday night. Boris Johnson said it couldn't be done. Promise made, promise delivered. The London Overground, people call it the hipster line. We now have night overground on a Friday and Saturday on those services as well. That's just in transport. I'll give you another in air quality. People were told, listen, the air quality in London can't be fixed. Nothing you can do about it. What have we done? We've managed to bring in low emission bus zones in the parts of London with the poorest air. Putney being number 1. Brixton being number 2. These cleaner buses are already cleaning up the air in those parts of London. The T-charge. I promised that what we do is get the most polluting vehicles. I can go on.
No, well, all right. Well, that's for Steve's benefit. So hopefully you've satisfied some of his queries. Also by text from Seb, who's in Stoke. Will there be an increase in London police numbers with regard to rising crime rates?
Seb, not unless the government in the budget next week announces not just a reversal of the cuts made, but additional funding of our police service. 80% of the funding the Met Police Service, and by the way, other police forces around the country receive comes from central government. We are a very centralised country. And so unless the government announces investment next week, and I met the Chancellor yesterday and lobbied him to get more investment for our police service.
Where would the money come from? I mean, you're of the view, with regard to Brexit, that we're going to be worse off after leaving the European Union.
I watched Theresa May's speech, and she said austerity's over in her conference speech.
She said it 3 times before, though, as you well know.
If austerity's over, then we should be invested in public services like the police, the NHS, youth services, preventative services.
You're being a bit disingenuous now, because you know that whatever Theresa May might have said in her speech, you know that the economic reality is that we're going to have less money to spend on public services. You can't. I mean, even if the Prime Minister is blowing smoke up the nation's fundament, you can't then join in.
Well, there's 2 things. She's seen the books, I haven't. So she's seen the books and then says, as a consequence, the age of austerity is over. You'll be aware from media reports this weekend of the windfall in relation to the studies done this weekend by the independent body saying actually the Chancellor's got more monies than he originally thought in relation to the amounts borrowed. But thirdly, there's a very easy way to have more monies to invest in public services rather than having to make plans for civil unrest, rather than having to make plans for stockpiling medicine, rather than having to make plans for turning a motorway into a car park, rather than making plans to hire ships to travel food from the other side of the channel to here. We can use those monies to invest in public services like the police service.
Speaking of police investigations, I'll read you a tweet. These sick, from the person who's in charge of the police in this country, these sick Asian paedophiles are finally facing justice. I want to commend the bravery of the victims. For too long they were ignored, not on my watch. There will be no-go areas. Why do you think Sajid Javid put Asian in that tweet?
Well, before I get to Sajid Javid, it's really important with these issues that we first talk about the victims for the simple reason that they've been neglected and ignored for too long, sometimes by local authorities, sometimes by the police, sometimes by social services. And when you read some of the reports, not just from Huddersfield, from Rotherham and Oxford, they are appalling. I think that the honest answer and the short answer to your question in relation to the tweet from the Home Secretary is quite clear now that there are Conservative politicians who think the way to succeed in the Conservative Party is by playing to the far-right narrative. There was no need at all, in my opinion, to insert the words Asian in that tweet or no-go areas. By the way, the sort of people who use the phrase no-go areas are Donald Trump. He used it in the context of London, and even Boris Johnson rebutted him when he said that, and also the EDL and far-right groups. And I make this point, look at the evidence, whether it's gangs that are grooming, whether it's paedophile rings, and look at the ethnic data about who they are. And it's the Home Secretary should know better. All I can surmise from this tweet is either he's receiving advice from those who want him to be the leader and advised him to do this to garner public support, to garner support amongst Conservative memberships, or he's in some sort of arms race with his competitor Boris Johnson about who can whip up this sort of the consequence of these sorts of views. I'll tell you this, by the way, James, which is really important. Let's not pretend that far-right groups aren't, as we speak, on leaflets printing the words of the Home Sec as evidence of some of the myths they've been perpetuating over the last few years. And as a consequence, actually, of some of these messages, of some of this language, I'm telling you, around the country, ethnic minorities, particularly those of Asian origin, those from the subcontinent, will be suffering more discrimination, will be at the receiving end of more abuse because of this sort of language.
There's a lot of money to be made, of course, from telling people who don't follow the news that stories about grooming gangs that have been in the news since at least 2011 aren't in the news, and then you ask them to send you money to continue your work. So you're essentially accusing Sajid Javid of being closer to that strand of public discourse than to your own.
Look, what I think all politicians should do is reflect very carefully on the comments they made, particularly if you hold around the great offices of state, and particularly when your ethnic origin means sometimes you're given more latitude than other politicians would be given. And, whether it was...
Because you can't accuse an Asian of being racist against Asians.
It's more difficult. It's more difficult, isn't it? And what should worry us all is that there are certain people in the Conservative Party who think the way to get to the top, whether you want to be the mayor, whether you want to be the leader of the Conservative Party, is to use language that is more divisive than language that is more unitary.
We asked the Home Office what he meant by no-go areas. I'd be interested in your response to their response. They insisted that he didn't mean it geographically.
What was meant by that then? Because we know, you and I both know, because we read a lot.
Would be no-go areas of inquiry. Would be, if I were to be defending him, that's what they would say. We just meant there won't be any areas where we won't make inquiries. But the choice of words is surely.
But we know, we're not naive, that those are the sorts of phrases used by the right and the far right. It's a phrase used by Donald Trump. And by the way, Boris Johnson, when he was mayor, actually rebutted that and said there were no no-go areas in London. And actually, I think Boris Johnson made the point of saying if he went to New York, the areas that would be no-go for him would be those areas that Donald Trump was in. That's before Boris Johnson decided to want to be the leader of the Conservative Party and changed his view on Donald Trump. And so, look, all I'd say is I'm not sure what the motivations of the Home Sec were. I actually think that on reflection, Sajid Javid will realise he I'll be generous, he made a mistake and would take steps to rectify that. But that shouldn't mean that we lose focus on these criminals and these paedophiles and on the public authorities that have let down these victims for too long.
One more, I think, before you go.
The next question, I think, is from Romford, and it's Reese. Good morning, Reese.
Good morning, Sadiq.
How you doing? What's your question?
Hi, I'm coming as a young bus driver myself.
Yep.
Now, I have two questions very quickly.
Yep.
The first issue I wanted to bring up is the toilets.
Yep.
Because now I do a variety of routes in London, and in the majority of them, I've had situations where the public toilets are a lot cleaner than the driver's ones. There's often not any soap, there's not working water, some of them look like they haven't been cleaned in months. And what it looks like is, from your perspective, you're spending money on certain things, but not the right things. Because these are basic necessities. For us to, let's say, to not have soap and then have to get back in that cab, that's not hygienic for anybody.
Sure. And what was your second question? You had two questions, you said, Reese.
My second question for you, in my opinion, is about the route cuts. Now, without going into too much detail, one of the routes that I particularly drive is the Route 25. And I'm sure you're aware, the 25 had a cut of 22 buses earlier last month.
Sure.
And what we're looking at the moment is a further cut in December of a further 9 buses. The problem is at the moment is we're having loading problems as it is, and the idea was to cut these final 9 buses when Crossrail opens.
Okay, we're just going to make sure we've got time to get some sort of answer to your question.
Thanks for your question.
Briefly, if you can.
So, in relation to toilets, look, Reece, when I became mayor, I was shocked to discover that a huge amount of routes haven't even got toilets. And you imagine if you're a woman bus driver during your period. And the idea just is shocking. And so what I've invested in is to make sure we have toilets on all our bus routes until we get planning permission for some of them. They're temporary toilets, but the idea is to get permanent toilets on all our bus routes as soon as possible. I will look into the issue of the quality of the cleanliness inside those toilets. Clearly, it's not good enough if some of these toilets haven't got the right facilities inside them. They're not being inspected, not being cleaned. So let me take that away, Reece, and look into what's going on with the toilets we've got that I've helped fund that aren't good enough for bus drivers. And this is 2018. Not 1918. Your second question about bus routes is really important that I remind listeners that the TfL are currently consulted on some routes changing frequencies and reductions. And let me explain the context, James. We have 9,000 buses in London. We have, roughly speaking, 700 routes. We're consulting on 30 of them, where the routes there'll be less frequent buses, or some of the route may change by them stopping a bit earlier. Why are we consulting on this? Because in some parts of London, in central London, and by these are central London buses, many buses during the course of the day are going empty. You go to Kingsway, you go to Park Lane, you go to London Bridge, you go to Oxford Street, and you'll see examples of back-to-back buses with nobody in them. At the same time, we know in outer London, there is a huge demand for buses. And what we're doing in this consultation, Reece, is reconfiguring the central London bus network so we can meet the needs of outer London, reduce congestion in central London, but also lead to better service by the fact there'll be less buses clogged up back-to-back on the Kingsway, London Bridge, etc. But it is a genuine consultation. So, Reece, if you've got views about your bus route...
Steve would say here, it's another pipeline, wouldn't he?
Well, hold on. If I don't consult, you would not unreasonably criticise me. If we do consult and the consultation ends in November, with the routes changing pretty soon, I'm criticised for consulting.
So watch this space.
Yeah. Well, no. What I'd say is, firstly, respond to the consultation. LBC may not like consultation. I do. I like listening to Londoners. LBC may not. and then
Shade.
Let's see what happens. But I say this, Reece. We're talking about 33 routes out of a total of 700 from the 9,000 buses, and the idea is to improve services, particularly in outer London. And the expectation is, although there may be less kilometres of buses in central London, there should be more in outer London.
And that, I think, concludes the latest episode of Speak to
It's been a pleasure,
Sadiq
James.
Khan.
See you soon.
Indeed. Is it another month, a month from today?
Yeah, the reason for the day last time was I was on jury service for 2 weeks, but I'm glad to be back.
You'd have thought the Mayor of London would be exempt from jury service. Could you have pulled rank on that, or did you fancy doing it as a lawyer, of course?
No, of course, I've deferred before, and of course I could have tried to, but I think it's right and proper that we do our civic duty and sit on a jury as trial by one's peers. And, I think it's really important whether you're, a bus driver like Reece or the Mayor of London, you should do your bit.
Sadiq Khan, many thanks. The time is 10:35. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Slightly late. Here's Simon Conway with your headlines.
Speaking to LBC, the London Mayor Sadiq Khan has accused the Home Secretary of playing to the far-right narrative.